It was supposed to be the dawn of freedom. October 2011, the world watched as Muammar Gaddafi's lifeless body was paraded through the streets of Sirte. After 4 decades of authoritarian rule, the self-proclaimed revolutionary was gone. Western leaders declared victory. Libya was liberated. Democracy had won. The tyrant was dead. But if that was liberation, what followed was something far worse. Today, Libya is not the thriving democracy the world imagined. It is a fractured land torn apart by militias, foreign mercenaries, and chaos. The country that once had Africa's highest living standards is now a patchwork of warlords and ruins. What went wrong? How did a nation that once dreamed of unity collapse into anarchy? This is the untold story of how the United States and its NATO allies broke Libya, not just by toppling a regime, but by destroying a nation's future. To understand Libya's downfall, we must rewind history, long before Gaddafi, before oil, before NATO, back to when the idea of Libya itself barely existed. For centuries, this land was a loose collection of territories: Tripolitania in the west, Cyrenaica in the east, and Fezzan in the south, loosely governed by the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a single nation but a crossroads of tribes, caravans, and empires. A gateway between the Sahara and the Mediterranean. Then came the Age of Empire. In 1911, Italy, seeking its own slice of colonial glory, invaded Libya under the pretext of liberation. In reality, it was conquest. The Italians turned Libya into a settler colony, displacing locals to make way for European migrants. Villages were burned, families were uprooted, but the Libyans did not submit quietly. Out of this struggle emerged a name that would echo for generations. Muammar, known as the Lion of the Desert, he led a guerrilla resistance that fought the Italian occupation for nearly 20 years. His men struck from the sands, harassing Italian troops who vastly outnumbered them. In 1931, Mukhtar was captured and executed, but his defiance became legend, a symbol of Libya's unbroken spirit. After his death, the Italians intensified their brutality. Entire communities were forced into concentration camps where tens of thousands perished from disease and starvation. But the Italians' control would not last forever. World War II changed everything. Libya became a battlefield. German and Italian forces clashing against the British and Free French. When the Axis powers fell, Italy lost its colonies, and Libya's fate once again was decided not by Libyans but by outsiders. The British took Tripolitania and the French occupied. Some wanted to divide Libya among the victors. Others wanted independence. In 1949, after years of debate, the newly formed United Nations decided that Libya should become the first African nation to gain independence through the UN. 2 years later, on December 24, 1951, Libya was declared an independent kingdom under King Idris, a religious leader from the Sanusi order in Syria. But independence did not mean prosperity. Libya was desperately poor. Its economy was stagnant, and its people survived on foreign aid and rents from Western air bases. The country needed a miracle. Then, it found oil. In 1959, vast reserves were discovered beneath the Libyan desert. Overnight, Libya went from one of the poorest nations in the world to one of the richest in Africa. Western companies flooded in, American, British, Italian, all eager to tap the newfound wealth. Oil money transformed Libya. Cities expanded. Roads, hospitals, and schools appeared. But with this new wealth came corruption. King Idris and his circle grew wealthy, while many ordinary Libyans felt left behind. The king's cozy relationship with the West, especially the United States and Britain, angered a new generation that was swept up in the wave of Arab nationalism. Spreading across the region by the 1960s, a young army officer named Muammar Gaddafi was watching events closely. Inspired by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser and the dream of Pan-Arabism, Gaddafi envisioned a Libya free from Western control and corruption. In 1969, while King Idris was abroad for medical treatment, Gaddafi made his move. Without a single shot fired, the monarchy was overthrown. The 27-year-old officer declared a new era, the Libyan Arab Republic. From that moment, Libya would never be the same. Gaddafi presented himself as a revolutionary, not a ruler. He abolished the old constitution and expelled Western military bases. Then he turned his attention to Libya's lifeblood, oil. Before Gaddafi, foreign corporations controlled Libya's energy wealth. He changed that almost overnight. He forced oil companies to renegotiate contracts, threatening nationalization if they refused. Eventually, they yielded. Libya's share of oil profits skyrocketed. For the first time, the country's wealth flowed to its people, or so it seemed. Under Gaddafi, Libya introduced free education, free healthcare, and subsidized housing. The standard of living rose dramatically. By the mid-1970s, Libya had the highest per capita income in Africa. But Gaddafi's vision didn't stop at home. He saw himself as a Pan-African and Pan-Arab leader, the one who could unite the continent against Western domination. He poured money into liberation movements and armed groups from Palestine to South Africa. He supported revolutionary causes across the globe, positioning Libya as a hub for anti-imperialist struggle. To some, he was a hero, a man defying the West. To others, he was a menace. By the late 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi's flamboyant image and anti-Western speeches made him one of the most controversial figures on earth. He mocked US presidents, funded insurgencies, and toyed with global power politics. Washington's patience eventually ran out. The Reagan administration branded him the mad dog of the Middle East. Accusations mounted that Gaddafi was funding terrorism from the IRA in Ireland to militant groups in Palestine. In 1986, after a bombing in Berlin linked to Libyan agents, the US retaliated with airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi. The bombs killed dozens, including Gaddafi's adopted daughter. From then on, Libya became a pariah state. International sanctions crippled its economy. Its reputation was in tatters. And in 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people, the world pointed fingers at Gaddafi. Libya was hit with even harsher sanctions. For a decade, the country was isolated. Yet Gaddafi was nothing if not strategic. By the late 1990s, he began to change course. Under pressure, he handed over suspects in the Lockerbie bombing, accepted international court rulings, and agreed to dismantle Libya's nuclear program. It was a dramatic turnaround. Suddenly, the pariah was becoming a partner. In 2003, the UN lifted sanctions. Western leaders lined up to shake his hand. British Prime Minister Tony Blair visited Tripoli, calling it a new chapter. US and European oil companies rushed back to Libya. Gaddafi was no longer the mad dog. He was a rehabilitated statesman. He helped the West fight terrorism, opened Libya's oil fields again, and was hailed for renouncing weapons of mass destruction. But behind this diplomatic comeback, Gaddafi's Libya was still built on fear. There were no political freedoms, no real opposition, and no tolerance for dissent. The same hand that gave out free housing also signed death warrants for critics. Executions were public. The state's power was absolute. Yet many Libyans tolerated it, believing the stability and prosperity were worth the trade. Then came 2011, the year that would change everything. Across the Arab world, protests erupted. Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, regimes that once seemed untouchable were collapsing overnight. When demonstrations broke out in Libya, Gaddafi responded not with reform, but with firepower. He vowed to crush the uprising, declaring that he would show no mercy. That's when the world intervened. By March 2011, as Gaddafi's forces closed in on the rebel stronghold of Benghazi, Western leaders sounded the alarm. The United Nations passed Resolution 1973, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO launched a bombing campaign. The United States, France, and Britain led the charge, joined by Arab allies like Qatar and the UAE. Officially, this was a humanitarian mission to prevent a massacre. President Barack Obama insisted it was not about regime change, but behind the rhetoric, other motives simmered. Libya was rich in oil. Its gold reserves were massive, and Gaddafi had become increasingly unpredictable. Leaked memos later revealed that France's president, Nicolas Sarkozy, saw the intervention as a way to secure oil interests and reassert French influence in Africa. Libya's wealth and Gaddafi's Pan-African ambitions had become a threat to Western dominance in the region. By the time NATO's bombs fell on Tripoli, the mission had quietly shifted. It was no longer about protecting civilians. It was about removing Gaddafi. The roar of jet engines echoed across the Libyan desert. March 2011, NATO's Operation Odyssey Dawn had begun. Missiles rained down on radar sites, command centers, and air defenses. Western television channels broadcast the images like a movie: precision strikes, dramatic night vision footage, talk of liberation. For the rebels in Benghazi, it felt like divine intervention. Gaddafi's armored columns were halted on the outskirts of the city. The skies above Libya now belonged to NATO. What began as a no-fly zone quickly became an open-ended bombing campaign. French Rafales, British Tornadoes, and American drones pounded Libyan forces day after day. In practice, the mission morphed from protecting civilians to dismantling the Libyan state. Communication lines were severed, fuel depots obliterated, government buildings reduced to rubble. The rebels, once fragmented militias, advanced behind the shield of Western firepower. Within weeks, Gaddafi's army was bleeding, senior officers defected, towns flipped allegiance, and the capital trembled. But Gaddafi refused to run. He moved from bunker to bunker, broadcasting fiery speeches, calling his opponents rats, and vowing to die on Libyan soil. For months, NATO insisted it wasn't trying to kill him, yet every bomb seemed to fall closer to his shadow. As spring turned to summer, the balance of power collapsed. Tripoli fell in August 2011. Rebel flags fluttered over the Bob al-Azizia compound, the symbol of Gaddafi's rule. The man who had dominated Libya for 42 years vanished into the desert. The world celebrated. In Washington, President Obama announced, "The shadow of tyranny has been lifted." In London and Paris, leaders congratulated themselves for another successful humanitarian intervention. But on the ground, Libya was unraveling. Sir Gaddafi's birthplace became his last stand. The city was encircled and pounded relentlessly. Civilians fled through streets littered with shells and corpses. When the fighting finally ended on October 20th, 2011, a convoy of loyalists tried to break out. NATO jets struck from above. Gaddafi's vehicle was hit. Wounded, he crawled into a drainage pipe, where rebels found him. What happened next was filmed on shaky mobile phones. The dictator bloodied, pleading, surrounded by men shouting vengeance. Moments later, he was dead. The footage went viral within hours. Western anchors smiled as they reported it. Hillary Clinton famously laughed on camera. "We came, we saw, he died." The operation was declared a triumph. Yet the very next morning, Libya began to disintegrate. With Gaddafi gone, there was no government strong enough to hold the country together. His regime had been the state, a web of tribal balances, oil revenues, and fear that kept rival regions in check. Remove that web, and the structure collapses. Weapons looted from army depots flooded the streets. Rifles, anti-aircraft guns, even surface-to-air missiles. The same militias NATO had armed now refused to disarm. Each claimed legitimacy as defenders of the revolution. Cities turned into fiefdoms ruled by local warlords. Tripoli, Misrata, Benghazi each became a separate kingdom, with its own flag and checkpoints. The United States and its allies withdrew almost immediately. There was no occupation plan, no reconstruction mission, no Marshall Plan for Libya. Western governments assumed democracy would bloom naturally once the dictator was gone. Instead, chaos filled the vacuum. By 2012, the National Transitional Council struggled to control even the capital. Elections were held, but the new parliament commanded no army. Ministries were raided by militias demanding jobs, money, or revenge. The revolutionary unity that had toppled Gaddafi dissolved into tribal rivalries and ideological feuds. Then came the attack that changed everything. September 11th, 2012, militants stormed the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans were killed. The building burned through the night as gunfire echoed across the city. Washington was stunned. The same region NATO claimed to have saved just a year earlier had turned against it. In the aftermath, Western embassies closed one by one. Diplomats fled. Libya was abandoned to its fate. Power fractured between 2 rival governments, one in Tripoli, another in Tobruk. Each claimed legitimacy, each backed by different militias and foreign patrons. The country descended into a proxy war. Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, Qatar, Russia, France, all pouring weapons and money into their chosen sides. By 2014, Libya was no longer a nation. It was a battlefield on the Mediterranean. The oil terminals that once funded the state became spoils of war. Smugglers turned the coast into a hub for human trafficking. Thousands of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa poured through Libya's unguarded borders, hoping to reach Europe. Many never made it, drowning at sea or ending up in detention camps run by militias. Reports emerged of open-air slave markets in southern towns, where desperate migrants were sold for labor or ransom. The same world that had intervened to protect civilians now looked away. Meanwhile, jihadist groups exploited the chaos. By 2015, ISIS had seized control of Sirte, the very city where Gaddafi had died. Black flags rose where his green banners once flew. Fighters from across North Africa flocked to Libya, turning it into a new front for global terrorism. American drones returned, this time to hunt the extremists their earlier intervention had unleashed. The irony was bitter. In the name of saving Libya, the US and NATO had dismantled the only force capable of keeping it intact. Inside the country, ordinary Libyans endured an endless nightmare: power cuts, kidnappings, inflation, and violence. Hospitals lacked medicine, schools closed, entire families disappeared while trying to cross checkpoints controlled by rival factions. Once, Libya's wealth had provided free housing and healthcare. Now, even clean water was scarce. For Africa, the shockwaves were immense. Gaddafi had poured billions into African infrastructure and the dream of continental unity. His fall severed funding for countless projects. Neighboring countries, Mali, Niger, Chad, were flooded with weapons and mercenaries returning from Libya's battlefields. Conflicts erupted across the Sahel. In Europe, the migrant crisis deepened, fueling political backlash and xenophobia. The chaos Libya exported reshaped global politics far beyond its borders. In Washington, the war soon became a topic no one wanted to discuss. The Obama administration called it leading from behind. Years later, Obama himself admitted it was his greatest foreign policy mistake, not the intervention, but the failure to plan for what came after. Yet for Libyans, that distinction meant little. The bombs had stopped, but the suffering had just begun. By the late 2010s, a strong man emerged from the eastern city of Benghazi, General Khalifa Haftar, a former Gaddafi officer turned exile. He returned with support from Egypt and the UAE, promising to restore order. His forces battled Islamist militias and advanced toward Tripoli, backed by Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group. The capital, meanwhile, was defended by militias aligned with the unrecognized government of National Accord. Armed and funded by Turkey. Foreign powers carved Libya into zones of influence. Turkish drones clashed with Emirati ones. Russian advisors dug trenches in the desert, while European diplomats held endless peace conferences that achieved little. Libya's vast oil wealth became the prize everyone wanted, and the curse no one could control. By 2020, a fragile ceasefire paused the fighting, but not the fragmentation. Elections were promised, then postponed again and again. Each side accused the other of corruption and betrayal. For ordinary Libyans, life remained suspended between past and future. A country rich in oil, yet poor in everything else. What began as a revolution for dignity had become a cautionary tale of intervention. The United States and its allies toppled a dictator without building a state. They spoke of freedom while leaving behind anarchy. And so, a question lingers: was Libya truly liberated, or merely broken? The truth is not simple. Gaddafi was a dictator. He ruled by fear, silenced dissent, and crushed opposition. But under his rule, Libya functioned. It had stability, infrastructure, and identity. The West, in its rush to save the country, underestimated how fragile that structure was. They replaced repression not with democracy, but with vacuum. Today, Libya remains divided between rival administrations. Militias still control ports and borders. Smuggling and corruption feed off what's left of the oil economy. Entire generations have grown up knowing only war. Tripoli's skyline glitters with cranes, but many projects stand abandoned. In Benghazi, ruins still bear the scars of NATO's bombs. And in the desert, the wind erases the traces of once mighty convoys and parades. Occasionally, foreign leaders gather to talk about stabilizing Libya. But most Libyans no longer believe in promises from abroad. They've seen too many interventions, too many slogans. They know the cost of misplaced hope. Perhaps that is the final tragedy of Libya. Not only the fall of a dictator, but the death of faith in the idea that foreign powers can bring freedom. When history looks back on 2011, it may not see a humanitarian victory, but a warning that the road to chaos is often paved with good intentions, and that nations can be destroyed, not just by tyranny, but by those who claim to end it. The dust of Sirte has long settled, but beneath it lies the echo of a lesson the world still refuses to learn, that breaking a country is easy, building one is not.